by her photographer partner who works along with her covering the border. And unfortunately, we just can't get the technology to work. But I know because I did it recently, the El Paso Times is offering you a 3-month subscription for only $1. And you can go on there and find all these photos. And I think you'll probably want to after her talk. So my name is Ted Peterson. I'm the Director of Student Media here, which means I'm advisor to the Crimson and some of the other media clubs. I'm also an Associate Professor of Communication. And for the past 12 years, we've been hosting a free speech celebration. And the reason that we host this is because I've been working with the Crimson for about 6 months or so, and I finally stumbled on their constitution. It was called the Florida Tech Media Board Governing Document. We've now changed to the Panther Media Group Governing Document. And it has a statement in there, and it says, freedom of the press, as guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, is not blocked or interfered with by Florida Tech or any of its trustees, administrators, faculty, or staff. And I thought, oh man, my students at the Crimson need to know this, that the administration has promised them that they can make the decisions about what goes into the newspaper. And then I thought, even better, the administration needs to be reminded that they've made this promise, that the material, the content that goes into the Crimson, it's there because the student editors found that information and thought that their readers needed it. And information that they decide, oh, we're not going to print, it's not withheld because the administration tells them to withhold it. It's withheld because they don't think it's newsworthy. Students get to make this decision. So because of that, we started Free Speech Day as an opportunity to remind the students on the staff, the student body, and the administration and faculty that the Crimson is a free press. And so it's evolved over the years. It survived COVID, and here we are doing it again in person without masks for the most part, which feels strange. But I want to introduce our speaker. Her name is Lauren Villagran. I'm sure I said that wrong. Villagran. Okay. She covers immigration and the U.S.-Mexico border for the El Paso Times and the USA Today network. In her 20-year career as a journalist, she has covered the financial markets in New York, the drug war in Mexico, humanitarian crises at the border, and the shifting patterns of migration across the Western Hemisphere. Villagran has reported for the Associated Press, the Los Angeles Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Albuquerque Journal, America's Quarterly, and others. She is a graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Please welcome Lauren to Florida Tech.
Let me test the mic. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic working? You're good? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ted, for inviting me. Thank you to Florida Tech for having me here. And also thanks for inviting everyone to subscribe to the El Paso Times. Maybe my editor will give me more trips to Florida if you do. It's really, really good to be here. I'm actually from Florida. I grew up in Pensacola, up north, so if anyone wants to stick around later and have a debate about whose beaches are better, I'm happy to do that. But I am here tonight because of where I live and work now, which is in El Paso, Texas. I cover the US-Mexico border for the El Paso Times and for USA Today. I'm part of USA Today's national immigration team. And you've probably seen El Paso and Juarez on the news or on your social media feeds for the past few months. We have been at the epicenter of a hemispheric humanitarian immigration crisis and the crossover point for hundreds of thousands of migrants in the past 6 months. I have an absolutely gorgeous presentation of photos from the photographer that I work with on a regular basis. His name is Omar Ornelas. Even without a subscription, you should be able to look him up online and see his visual work of what we've been going through in El Paso. I'd like to start with a number, 2.4 million. That is the number of migrant encounters at the southwest border in fiscal 2022 through October, according to the US Border Patrol. That number sounds big, and it is historically speaking. The last time encounters at the border were anywhere near that high was in the year 2000, when they topped 1.6 million. It was a completely different time at the border, and I know because I was there. I got my first real job as a journalist working for a small business weekly in El Paso called El Paso Inc. It was a chance to almost be a foreign correspondent from the day I started journalism because I could walk out my door and in 10 blocks be in Mexico. I'd like to share a story from that time because I think it does say a lot about where we are today at the border. One of my first assignments as a cub reporter in El Paso was to ride along with a Border Patrol agent. I remember going out with this agent at night. His name was Agent Hidalgo, and that it was pitch black in the desert hills outside El Paso, except where the headlights of his SUV were illuminating the desert. We bounced along in his truck, and he showed me how agents would drag tires behind the vehicle to smooth the sand so that they could see the footprints of migrants. Something they still do, actually. That night, Hidalgo's radio cackled off coordinates where something or someone had tripped the seismic sensors in the ground. We sped toward the action, where agents were leapfrogging each other to chase migrants on foot to avoid getting tired. We followed the agents until they apprehended their suspects, 2 boys from Durango, which is a state in northern Mexico. They were teenagers. As a 22-year-old from Florida, I had never seen anything like it. A place where children, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, would run through a dangerous desert because they wanted to work. The other thing I learned that night is that those 2 boys had crossed twice already. At the time, migrants could cross the border 14 times and accept what was called a voluntary return back to their country, which at that time was almost exclusively Mexico, before they would face any consequence. In the years that followed, several things happened that dropped migration at the southwest border to historically low levels, to below 400,000 apprehensions or encounters per year. One was the decision during the second Bush administration, ramped up to extreme levels during the Obama administration, to prosecute everyone who crossed the border unlawfully or who was picked up for being undocumented inside the United States by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The Department of Homeland Security called that consequences delivery. There was a federal judge just outside El Paso in New Mexico who for years had the highest caseload of any federal judge in the entire country. And that's because he was sentencing people who had been prosecuted for crossing the border unlawfully. His name is Robert Brack. He's retired now, but I bet he still holds that caseload record. I would sit for hours in his courtroom and watch him high on his bench in his black robe, sentencing thousands of people charged with a 1326 felony for crossing the border illegally. He would ask if they had anything to say for themselves, and often they'd apologize in Spanish and explain why they had crossed unlawfully. I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember Brack sentencing a man who had crossed the border in the 1980s when the border really truly was wide open. You could just pay 25 cents in El Paso and ride a little floaty over to the other side, and many people crisscrossed at that time. In any case, this man had gone to Salt Lake City, and he had started a family, and he had a wife, and he had children in Salt Lake. Because he had crossed multiple times, he was ineligible to, for example, get married and then cross legally, so he lived undocumented. He had returned to Mexico when his mother died to bury her, and he had no way back but to cross again illegally. And it's worth mentioning here that there is no line to get into the country, especially for Mexicans. Judge Brack would give the same spiel over and over again. Don't come back. He would say, I know how hard it will be for you to follow that order, but you won't do your family or you any good in jail. And sometimes he would give them jail time because they would ignore his warning and they would try to cross again. The pull of family in the United States was just too great. Still, jail time was a deterrent for many people. The second thing that happened was a huge expansion of the Border Patrol. In 2002, when I went out with Agent Hidalgo that night, there were about 10,000 Border Patrol agents covering the entire Mexican and Canadian borders. And a decade later, by the time these numbers dropped at the border, there were more than 21,000 agents at the border. Today, it's in the 19,000 range. The third thing at that time that helped drop unlawful immigration at the border, and perhaps the most powerful thing, was the Great Recession. Border crossings correlate highly with US demand for workers, whether legal visas are available to them or not. When the jobs dried up, people stopped coming, and thousands of others who found themselves out of work went home. As the economy recovered during the second Obama administration, the number of people crossing the southwest border began rising again. And then something happened that no one was prepared for, something the US government still can't get its arms around. Children began coming to the southwest border on their own or in the hands of smugglers, even small children. Then parents with their children and entire extended families. The border infrastructure and US immigration laws weren't made with these demographics in mind. The whole system was built to prevent single adult males from sneaking across the border. In El Paso, whistleblowers and advocates revealed that Border Patrol was holding children, including toddlers, in holding station cells that were built like jails. The Trump administration then decided to separate the children from their parents in order to prosecute the adults, as the Obama administration had done when the adults were traveling alone. Americans couldn't stomach that idea. It's worth remembering that 7 children died in the custody of US border agencies during the Trump administration, during the time of family separation. And then the other thing that happened was that people began seeking asylum, the only lawful path into the country for the destitute. It didn't matter whether their claims met the high bar of US asylum law. What they heard, what migrants heard, and what they saw was that the US was granting permiso, permission to enter the country legally. So let's fast forward to today. Remember the 2.4 million. I mean, that is a huge number. But you need to know another number, 1.1 million. Last year in fiscal 22, it wasn't 2.4 million people who crossed the border. That represents the number of times the Border Patrol encountered a migrant. Border Patrol expelled people 1.1 million times over the same period. So that means that 45%, or nearly half of all of the encounters last year, resulted in the migrant being quickly expelled to Mexico or to their country of origin. You've probably heard about Title 42. It's the Trump administration order that dates to the beginning of the pandemic and that has been continued under the Biden administration. That policy allows Border Patrol to quickly expel migrants to Mexico or to their home country, in most cases. And it's called expulsion, but for all intents and purposes, as someone who works on the border, it looks exactly like the voluntary returns that landed those 2 boys from Durango back in Mexico 20 years ago. There's no limit on how many times people can cross under Title 42, the way there was when Judge Brack was sentencing people to jail time during the days of consequences delivery. At one point in fiscal 22, nearly 1/3 of the people encountered had crossed multiple times, sometimes 10 times apiece. Some of those encounters were with people who tried to sneak into the country and evade Border Patrol. So someone who scales the wall or sneaks through a gap in the wall and tries to evade Border Patrol. And they would be quickly returned to Mexico or their country of origin. But if returned to Mexico, they might try it again and again. Others were people who walked through the low-running Rio Grande River and lined up at the steel border fence, waiting hours or days to seek permission to enter the country. And I really encourage you to go seek out these photos by the photographer I work with, because you will see how long these lines were, hundreds and hundreds of people just trekking through the river. For weeks and months, I watched them early in the morning, late at night, with babies in their arms and children on their backs. Everyone comes with a story of what happened to them in their country or on the terrible route north. But here's the crazy thing. Whether any of them would be given a chance to seek asylum in the United States was and is random. It has more to do with Border Patrol staffing levels and holding capacity and US-Mexico relations than whether or not a person's asylum claim is valid. Here's an example. I met 2 women in 2021. They were both Haitian. Marie was in her 40s and Brigitte was in her 20s. Marie was a trained nurse. Brigitte hoped to study to become a nurse. Both had left the chaos of Haiti for South America in the years prior. Marie had worked a couple of years in Brazil. Brigitte had worked in Chile. Around the same time, politics and economic trends changed in both countries, and immigrants were no longer welcome. They had been invited to those countries as mano de obra, as labor, and then when the politics changed, basically, the country stopped renewing their visas. Things in Haiti had gotten much worse, and the women were both essentially stateless. Both women, separately, they didn't know each other, traversed 2 continents by bus and on foot, crossing the dangerous jungle between Colombia and Panama, and they both reached the US border. Marie tried multiple times to seek asylum in the US. She crossed at Tijuana, she crossed in Juarez, that's where I met her, and she was sent back to Mexico each time. I met Villagran at the Mexico-Guatemala border in southern Mexico before she would make her attempt a few months later to cross at Del Rio. You may all have remembered the encampment that happened at Del Rio, Texas. She had crossed just before that encampment was formed. And while Marie was expelled over and over again, Villagran made it in on her first try. And the last I knew, she was living in Fort Lauderdale. Why did she get a chance to seek asylum while Marie did not? And there's a complex answer to that question rooted in logistics, personnel, again, the holding capacity, and US-Mexico relations that we can chat about maybe when we have our conversation. But from a migrant's perspective, what it really boils down to is luck, and luck fuels hope. Let me connect this picture of the US-Mexico border to the theme of this week's celebration of First Amendment rights. There is only so much a government, an administration, or the powers that be will tell you as a journalist. As a journalist, the best way to inform the public is to bear witness, to be there, to go where you aren't invited and sometimes where you're not wanted, and watch and ask questions of everyone. In my case, as a border reporter, that means talking to Border Patrol agents. It means spending time at the borderline and talking to migrants, visiting shelters and speaking with advocates. It means hanging out at the international bridges before dawn and chatting with Mexican security guards and soldiers, and above all, just watching. Watching if what the US government says it's doing is actually what's happening on the border, and often there is a large gap between those two things. And it also means talking to the people who call the border home, los fronterizos. Neither the US asylum system nor the country's immigration laws were designed to be about luck. If the border looks like a disaster on TV, it's in part because consecutive presidential administrations have tried to contort an outdated immigration system to fit the needs of the US labor market and the demands for border security within the limitations of the executive branch. The migration numbers are high, but they're not catastrophic. They do underscore, though, that the issue of mass migration is worth discussing. Immigration is not a natural disaster, and while it's not possible to predict exact flows, we know when people are moving north en masse. The world has changed many times over, and Congress has not acted since 1986 to create a new immigration system, one that could once be more humane, more secure, and more flexible to meet the needs of the US economy and a global labor force on the move. I know there's no shortage of ideas to rebuild the immigration system or the border infrastructure because I hear about them all the time. What I think is missing is courage and leadership on the part of elected officials. The last time Republicans and Democrats came to the tables to seriously discuss immigration reform was a decade ago, 2013. Since then, Republicans have preferred to use the language of fear and of invasion and of disaster to motivate voters to the polls. And Democrats have preferred to demonize Republicans and make promises that they have immigrants' best interests at heart, that they're the only ones who can fix what's broken, but they have yet to do it. It's been left to migrants and immigrants themselves to uphold the country's 200-year tradition of serving as a beacon of freedom in the world. Their journey here is proof of their belief in core American values. And there are consequences to inaction, the human suffering that no one pays attention to. The mother I saw who was rescued from the river current as her 5-year-old daughter was swept down the river and drowned. The trauma of the 2 babies who survived being dropped over a 30-foot border wall by smugglers. The struggles of border communities to provide humanitarian aid to all who need it, and the many, many people who lose their lives in their quest for freedom. This is why the First Amendment is so important. As a free press, we have an obligation to bear witness, to tell people what's going on and what their government is and isn't doing about it. As a free press, we must, even in the most painful of circumstances, be there to shine the light. I believe that information empowers, and the reporting of a free press, protected by the First Amendment, is the soil in which our democracy is grounded. And there too, I think, are the seeds for change. Thank you.
Shook, the editor-in-chief of the Crimson, and I are going to ask a few questions, and then, of course, we'll open it up to the floor for a few more questions. Thank you so much for that talk. That was really, really good. So my question is, who are these people that are coming across the border? Are they a threat? Are they smuggling drugs? Are they truly seeking asylum? What are some of the stories that you know about these folks?
How much time do we have? There are all kinds of people. I mean, I've spent 20 years off and on covering immigration and the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And even in the past 3 years with the El Paso Times, I've had an opportunity to speak with, I mean, I might say hundreds of migrants from really all over. Turkey, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, just from all over. And, you know, as a journalist, it's not for me to judge whether their asylum claim will meet the bar. I can hear people's stories. As a human, I can make a judgment call of whether I think they're telling the truth or not. But in my mind, that's really neither here nor there. I think one of the key issues is that the US does not have a system or a border infrastructure set up to determine whether claims are valid. And there are a lot of ideas about what that could look like. Are they a threat? You know, I don't think when you have hundreds of thousands of people moving anywhere that you could say that they are all good people, that they all have the best intentions. Again, that's not for me to judge. I know that Border Patrol and ICE routinely pick up criminals, you know, people who have outstanding warrants in the US and who've tried to cross again, and they do great work as law enforcement agencies, routing out those who may have you know, an issue in their background. I think it's important to understand the different flows. So the folks who may be coming with bad intent or who already have a criminal background are likely not lining up to seek asylum. Because when you line up to seek asylum in the current process, it looks disorderly on TV, but I've been there and it's fairly orderly. People will come and they are fingerprinted, a background check is run. If you have anything in your background, you're going to be arrested on the spot and then prosecuted based on whatever warrant. What was the third? There was a third piece of that.
I asked about drugs.
Drugs. Drugs are a huge problem, obviously. US demand for drugs is the #1 problem. And I think it's really important not to conflate migrants presenting themselves at the border or even crossing illegally with the movement of drugs. The vast majority of illicit substances that enter this country come through the ports of entry and they are smuggled by US citizens. The statistics by US Customs and Border Protection bear that out. You can get a lot more through in a vehicle than you can in a backpack. And while cartels do sometimes recruit migrants who have run out of money and have no way into the country, you know, you do hear from migrants that they've been approached by people to carry something in. That's almost always, and I think Border Patrol will say this, like a decoy, like, let's direct attention here so that we can smuggle another load of humans over here. But yeah, it comes through in passenger vehicles. I mean, you all probably saw that Texas Governor Abbott last year made a big fuss around the commercial truck traffic, saying that he was looking for drugs and whatnot. And he stopped up the border for about 10 days, ended up having to talk to all of the governors in Mexico, and found nothing, in part because the commercial trucks go through a lot of checks and they've got millions of dollars of legitimate commerce that they're running and cannot be troubled by drug running. I mean, it's just too risky for them, so it's almost all coming over in passenger vehicles. So it's a huge problem, but it's important for policymakers to understand that so that the money goes where that's needed to fight that issue.
So you've touched on this a few times already, like in your last question and in your speech, But what exactly do we need to know about asylum laws to understand the border?
Okay, one, I think it's important to realize that like the people coming have not necessarily read US asylum law. I mean, I've been doing this work for a really long time, and there's still a lot that I don't understand. It's very, very complicated. So the important thing to understand, I think, one, is that there are a large number of people who are trying to seek admission to the United States legally, and that's the only door they see open. So that's important for policymakers to understand as they think through, if they ever decide to think through, reworking our immigration system. Okay, if people are using asylum this way, how do we distinguish between people who really just want to work and see this as a legal pathway into the country, which it is, versus those who may absolutely need refuge from persecution in their country. You know, I met a guy like in 2020 who had come during Trump's migrant protection protocols when he was pushing everybody back to Mexican border cities. And he did not really have an asylum claim. But the way that he understood asylum was that they're granting permiso. This is the permission that we get to come in and work for a couple of years, and if we can prove our claim, great, and if we can't, then we're sent back. But I'm not crossing illegally. I'm standing in line. I'm giving my fingerprint. So it is misused. Are people trying to game the system? Maybe some are, but I mean, you have to remember that people are getting their information through social networks and basing what they've heard and seen from others who have come before them.
So surely you've seen some really difficult things. You touched on it today. And in El Paso, we talked about this a little bit on the phone, was the site of a mass shooting. Another similar event took place at a mall. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with self-care? How do you cope with that so that it doesn't spill over into your non-journalism life?
I think it does. I think that there is a growing awareness of, first I would say like first responders. I'm not saying journalists are first responders, although we are often there also at the same time first. But there's a growing awareness in the medical community, in the first responder community, and also in journalism that we do absorb a lot. We see a lot, and how do we process that? I mean, I'm in my 40s, so I'm a little more old school. I don't think first about self-care as I think a younger generation rightfully does. And I try to learn from my younger colleagues in that respect. But I feel like first is the commitment to the storytelling and to communicating whatever has happened. And then it's really important to come back, and I think everyone has their own personal way, but it is important to recognize that those things do affect you. And you know, you mentioned the mass shooting in El Paso. In some ways, I think it changes the way that we do our work. Like, that mass shooting specifically, it's hard to remember because there's so many in the US, but this was the mass shooting in which a white man from a suburb of Dallas drove 10 hours to El Paso. He posted a kind of quote-unquote manifesto online minutes before he entered the Walmart with an AK-47 that said that he was coming to kill Mexicans, that he believed there was an invasion of Texas, and he gunned down 23 members of the binational community, so people who were Mexican-American, Mexican nationals. This was a Walmart that is literally minutes from Mexico, from the border. And here in Florida, I'm sure most of what you hear about the border has to do with immigration, but for those of us who live there, our lives are cross-border. You know, hundreds of thousands of people cross every day back and forth legally. I live part-time in Juarez. I go back and forth constantly. So to come back to your question, I think it becomes part of the rest of the work that you do, because if that man was motivated by the language of invasion, it's very hard as a reporter in El Paso to tolerate that kind of language at all and to not question it as a method of describing immigration.
So we kind of already talked about how dangerous it is to cover this kind of stuff. So how do you avoid and or deal with it when you're actually trying to do the reporting?
Yeah. So I'd like to just start by saying that that as a U.S. citizen, I have immense privilege in covering the border. My Mexican colleagues face far more danger. Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the Western Hemisphere to work as a journalist. I have colleagues who have been killed in Tijuana, in Juarez, in southern Mexico. If you're interested in learning more about that, Artículo 19, Article 19, does a lot of work about the journalist safety in Mexico. So just carrying a blue passport grants me a level of privilege that it's really important to recognize. But immigration, for example, you know, you have to be careful because there are people who are coming and they're seeking asylum, but there are others who are being smuggled, and those networks are connected to organized crime, and they're interlaced with drug smuggling networks as well. Unfortunately, and I hate to say this to a journalism class, but there are times when you just have, sorry, I just gave this speech. You really have to look the other way, and you have to just not write about some things. Like I just spent time at the International Bridge because the government will say it's doing one thing, and then when you're there, you see that it's something else. And I was watching the Title 42 expulsions, and you know when it's people that have been that have sought asylum and have been expelled because they're typically horrified that they've been returned to Mexico, and they're sometimes break down crying when they reach. Mexico is at the top of the bridge, so when you walk over the bridge, that's the line. It's at the very, very top, and the minute you step over, you can no longer step back. So they'll fall apart. But sometimes it will be like people who are trying to come to work in the US, and the coyote or the smuggler packages now might be something like, you know, at the borderline $3,000 or $4,000 for 3 tries. And so they will, blinders on, march straight back into Mexico, no shoelaces in their shoes because Border Patrol takes the shoelaces. And I followed them down, and I was trying to talk to them. No one wanted to talk to me. And we get to the base of the bridge, and I watch as these cars with dark polarized windows pull up. And they all just pile in and zip off. And you know that they're coyotes. And I gain nothing from writing about that, or, you know, I mean, unfortunately, because I crossed the border, and my colleague Omar Ornelas, who is Mexican, you know, we honestly do not cover cartel stories at all. We have at the El Paso Times a colleague named Daniel Burunda who covers the crime report, La Nota Roja, and he does not cross the border. So he will write those stories based on interviews and whatnot, but he does not cross the border at all. And so you know, you have to be really careful.
Again, another issue that you've touched on, but can you describe for us the relationship between El Paso and Juarez, and how has that historically been? How has it been during this crisis, and what do you think it's going to be like going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the border is such a fascinating place. Like, again, being from Florida, I'm actually so grateful that you all are here, because it's like, in Florida, I'm very interested to hear from everyone, like, why the border is interesting. You know, to you, because a lot of times all you see is the immigration, but like living there, it's absolutely fabulous. Like, I leave my house, in 15 minutes I'm in Mexico, and I heard you talking about burritos. I'm sure our burritos are better. We can also have that debate.
I guarantee they are.
You know, so I have, like, we all have access to these 2 worlds that are like constantly meshing and flowing, And the cultures are different, but they're so similar in some ways, and there's just constant code switching from English to Spanglish and to Spanish. You know, and it's a place where people live in Juarez and work in El Paso, or they live in El Paso and they work in Juarez, or you know, they have these different lives. In the pandemic, you all might remember that the Trump administration, as one of the COVID measures, was to shut down the borders, and Canada also shut down its border to us. And so I wasn't the only one in this situation, but Mexican nationals with visas, with legal visas, could not cross the border for the longest time. And at one point, it became ridiculous because people could fly in from Mexico, but you couldn't drive across the border, so it sort of completely locked us off from each other. But as a COVID measure, nearly 2 years into it, I was digging into a story and I was looking at the numbers. And in August of 2021, 2 months before the restrictions were lifted, there were 800,000 personal vehicle crossings just in El Paso in August, with the border closed. 800,000, okay? So I was like, well, this is working. But what it goes to show you is that the border is a place where, like, a lot of people are binational citizens. You cannot shut the border down because U.S. citizens cannot be kept out of their country. So, you know, we made it through. But you know, it's a fascinating place, and it has a very long history of having both this sisterly, brotherly love, but also a lot of friction. So you can go back to like the 1960s, the end of cyclical migration for Mexicans when the Bracero program ended. And it was a time when people were crossing and they were delousing people. I mean, you can see these horrific events in which the U.S. exerts its power over the nation, you know, our neighbor nation. And I think when we look at all of the geopolitical instability in the world, I feel like maybe we don't give Mexico enough credit, as many problems as Mexico has. We have a 2,000-mile border that's peaceful, you know, with a country that we are not at war with. And I think we need to remember that when we're talking about the immigration debate.
So what are the biggest challenges to covering the border?
I feel like I covered some of that.
We had a good plan with these questions.
Sorry for answering all of them.
Well, this will be our last question, and then we'll open it up. You're not a politician, but if you had a magic wand, what would you do? What needs to happen for this situation to be resolved in a humanitarian way?
I mean, I think rather than answer that from the perspective of like, this is what I think needs to be done, I think I might say that as a journalist, I would love to just see people come to a table and talk it through in a, you know, and like use their listening skills. Again, like I said in my remarks, mass migration is worth talking about. It's not going away. There's a lot of instability in the Western Hemisphere. The US, I think I read this somewhere, and I'm sorry for being a journalist without citing the exact source, but there are like 2 jobs for every 1 American right now, still, even as we possibly head towards a recession. If we head into a recession, mark my words, you will see the number of migrants at the border drop off. It's just going to happen. That being said, you know, the pandemic was incredibly destabilizing for countries that were already unstable. And through social media, the paths have been opened. So the Darien Gap, that was really something that nobody could cross before. You can see these photographs in the New York Times recently. A journalist followed some migrants through this jungle between Colombia and Panama that is traversable now. People die, but people also die at the US border, and they still come, they still try. So I think that if politicians, elected officials, would come together, this is just going to sound utopian and ridiculous at this point, but that is what's needed. I mean, there are people who have proposals. On the left, you can look at US Representative Veronica Escobar from El Paso. She has a series of proposals around creating kind of like humanitarian welcome centers where people who wanted to present could show up, say, here's why I came, here's my claim, and somebody would be there to say, okay, you qualify for a work visa, or you qualify for asylum, or you qualify for this other path, or you know what, you qualify for nothing, and I'm sorry, we're going to have to send you back. And there are proposals on the right from, you can look at the Bush Institute in Texas, very conservative, and they have a laundry list of proposals for how to address this new reality, the new demographics at the border. Again, the problem is that the people who make the laws are the elected officials, and they must take some action. So, you know, is it chicken or the egg, or, you know, are American voters going to have to demand that we need immigration reform? It's just become such an echo chamber of, you know, as I said, like, Republicans speaking to what their base wants to hear, Democrats speaking to what their base wants to hear, and for those of us who live on the border, I'll end my response to this question with this. Republicans and Democrats in a place like El Paso do talk to each other, and they don't tend to view this through the really extreme lenses that you see in the national media. You hear priests talking about it at Catholic Mass. How are we going to address this? How are we going to help? Our former mayor is Republican, our current mayor is Democrat. They both did the very same things. How can we shelter people? How can we feed people? What can we as a community do to protect ourselves and also to welcome those who are being admitted to the country? So I don't know, I guess I'd love to make the call that people in Congress listen to people in El Paso who have deep experience with this, or to other border communities, because the conversation is just less strident.
Very good, thank you. So we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
So I'm kind of getting the impression that people who live in the border communities are not all that upset about migrants coming in. That would be okay with them?
I wouldn't make to restate the question for those listening online, are people in border communities not upset about the number of people coming? I would not generalize about border communities, because you're going to find different politics in different border communities and also different needs. So if you go deep into Texas, into rural Texas, and I was just there a few months ago, I drove the whole border from El Paso, the whole Texas border from El Paso down to McAllen. And you will find people who are afraid to send their kids to school because their school will be on lockdown because it's a mile from the border and someone's running drugs over the border. Not necessarily migrants, but cartels. There are people in Eagle Pass who don't understand why there might be people with a different kind of Spanish accent from Venezuela walking through the back alleyways. They may not initially understand that it's because Border Patrol has admitted them into the country and they've got nowhere to go. People are often afraid of what they don't know or don't understand, and that can play into feelings, big feelings about migration. In a place like El Paso, you had hundreds of Venezuelans sleeping in the street after they were admitted by Border Patrol, or in some cases had snuck through. And I was down there, and I mean, little old ladies in minivans were just pulling up and dropping off milk cartons. So you're going to find a wide range of feelings about whether people deserve help, how to help them, or how to better secure the border. But I do think that in border communities, people are more accustomed to having that conversation and to it not just being politically extreme. But it doesn't mean that everybody's happy about it or okay with it.
Is it 50-50?
I mean, I think it's going to depend on the particular stream of migration happening at a particular place. I'm sorry not to be able to give a...
I mean, I would think like, okay, these communities, this is what I'm learning now, is it is not that all these people are so against it and moving out. It's like you're saying, it's kind of a pleasure to be able to cross the border and
Oh, yes, no, of course. I mean, it's a pleasure to cross for those of us who live on the border. Yes, we're residents, yeah.
So it's not like you're all moving out of town because you're too close to the border or something.
Right, no.
That is very new to me, I'll just be honest with you. the other thing is when these people come over hoping to come into the United States, and whether they're from whatever country, and a lot of them are pushed back to Mexico, what does Mexico do with them?
Tolerates them in some cases. It's the relation, I also think, again, coming back to our relationship with Mexico, the only reason why the United States can do this is because Mexico has agreed to it. So it requires a lot of diplomacy on the back end. Obviously, the US can return Mexicans to Mexico. That's just a repatriation or a deportation, and we have the right to do that. We do not have the right, although at different times, even when we did not have the right, Border Patrol would do it. We don't have the right to drop someone from a different nationality into another country. So you can't just send a Venezuelan to Mexico because we don't want the Venezuelan. That's part of what creates these challenges at the borderline. And people like Representative Escobar said, and also on the right have said, you don't want people to reach the border, that the issues of migration need to be handled in country. Not once people get to the border, the limits on what the US government can do are extreme. So the US spends a lot of time negotiating with Mexico. So in October, the Biden administration struck a deal with Mexico that Mexico would accept 30,000 Venezuelans a month. But Mexico asked for more work visas for Mexicans, and the Biden administration gave them that. So it is a constant push and pull.
Wow, thank you.
Yes, ma'am?
The asylum system seems to be just a limbo or bottleneck because the people who are able to apply for asylum and are allowed to stay in the States, they are like that for years and years and years, and it never changes. I personally know 2 people, one who's been here 10 years waiting for his to be processed, another who's been here 5 years. So what are we accomplishing with just giving them the permission to apply for asylum?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that consecutive administrations have tried to address that. I believe the Biden administration has added more immigration judges because there are 2 different asylum processes. You can cross legally and then seek asylum through, I think it's called the affirmative process, but through USCIS. And you also can go through the immigration court system. So first, there's 2 different paths. And you're correct. People can wait years to see an immigration judge. I met a mother and her son in 2018 who are just getting before a judge this year on their asylum claim, and that actually feels relatively quick, 4 years. So yeah, I mean, that goes back to one of the Congresswoman's proposals about a humanitarian welcome center where some of the asylum issues could be addressed at the border rather than sending people into the country to then wait years for a claim. I mean, there are complications. And actually, I believe Representative Tony Gonzalez, who is a Republican and also represents a piece of El Paso and then a big chunk of the border in Texas, has had a similar proposal from a different political viewpoint on a fast-paced adjudication at the border. You know, it's very complicated because you can look at the asylum figures, and people who are represented by an attorney have a vastly improved chance of winning asylum, and you won't have an attorney if you apply at the border and your case is adjudicated within hours or minutes. So advocates for immigrants will say, that's not acceptable. People have been on a traumatic journey. How are they going to defend this very complicated asylum case on their own? You know, but those who would like to see immigration better controlled will say, well, you know, what else are we going to do? And again, there are a lot of ideas out there, but I don't know that people are at the table really discussing them in good faith. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hello. So I actually lived in El Paso and worked with Border Patrol for 16 months. And what I would say is, before I started doing that, my thoughts on immigration and the wall in general and the border were a lot different than what they are now. From thinking that, you know, taking at face value from the media of that it's just you know, drugs and criminals and they're not sending their best, and that was the quote from that. And after seeing there, you know, it's a real eye-opening experience. to seeing that, you know, it is just a lot of times on the wall, people crossing are families. I've seen mothers drop their toddlers over the wall. I've seen pregnant women, you know, shatter their legs jumping off the wall trying to come over, and you just see, you know, really horrible things there that gave me a new perspective. And I'm just wondering if what changed in your thoughts from before you started working as a border reporter or living in El Paso to now?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the wall, and kudos to you for that experience. The work of Border Patrol agents is really, really hard for so many reasons. I mean, one of the things that changed that I think is really important is the height of the wall. So the wall used to be, it's a fence really, it's called pedestrian bollards, and you could reach your hand through it and touch someone on the other side, but they're these steel bollards. And during the Obama administration, Bush began the building of the fence, I believe, and Obama continued it, and it was an 18-foot fence. And Border Patrol, and feel free to chime in, but Border Patrol will often say that the wall, whatever the height, will not stop anyone, but it will slow people down, and it helps agents funnel people through areas that they can then patrol in a more narrow fashion. Advocates will say it pushes people into the more dangerous parts of the desert where they risk death. But having covered the border for a really long time, when it was 18 feet, you know, people built 19-foot ladders and would get over the wall. But since it became 30 feet, exclusively under the Trump administration, you know, I can't help but question, I would actually love to FOIA documents about what the discussion was about making it 30 feet. 30 feet is where, like, the human brain starts to get vertigo, and when they built the 30-foot wall, people built a 31-foot ladder. But what happens with the migrants is that the coyotes will get them up to the top, but then they don't tell them that there won't be a ladder on the other side. They tell them to slide down. And this is like a rough steel, it's not a fireman's pole. I mean, it's rough steel, it's rough on your hands. You can imagine you've walked through the desert, which is freezing at night, even in the summer. It's very cold in the middle of the night. Your hands are numb, and people fall. And I did a story last year working with the county emergency room, the main emergency hospital, that they had seen like a 300% increase in severe border fall injuries. People breaking their pelvis, people breaking their ankles, the kind of thing that requires a recovery for like weeks or months. Of course, this is a taxpayer-funded hospital, so, you know, is the federal government picking up those bills? In a lot of cases, it's not. So, you know, that's a huge difference to me. And, you know, I don't know how, when were you there? Were you there during the 30-foot wall?
From 2020 to 2021.
Yeah, so you were there, yeah, so you probably saw some awful stuff.
When they were switching it over.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about first responders and self-care and all of that. Border Patrol agents really go through a lot, because whether they're processing asylum seekers who have little children with them, or they're responding, you know, Border Patrol has emergency responders as well. They also have a special rescue, like an elite rescue force. They are now required anytime that they witness a death to enter mental health counseling, because they really see a lot, and they get a lot of, it's worse because they get a lot of flack, but they're doing the job that Congress has set out for them to do. Yeah.
Are they abusive? I mean, I think we heard something about the whipping of a couple of Border Patrol agents,
Yeah.
whipping, and no, that wasn't true. Yes, it was true. Are they abusive?
I wasn't in Del Rio, but my colleagues were. I think that those photos speak for themselves in that no human was whipped, but there was clearly a dynamic that you could see in those photos of law enforcement, horse-mounted law enforcement, and vulnerable migrants of color. And that was very, very triggering for a lot of people. Are there abusive Border Patrol agents? Absolutely. I mean, in any law enforcement agency in this country, you can see what, you know, the debate that our country has been in for years, decades now about, you know, use of force. It's a problem in the Border Patrol as well. And I think that what's interesting that I don't know that a lot of people understand is like the vast majority of Border Patrol agents come from the border. A lot of them are of Mexican descent, a lot of Puerto Ricans as well. And so there are a great number of agents who have a lot of compassion and affinity. And they'll often say, you know, because I talk to the Border Patrol every day, or if not every other day, you know, we're mothers and fathers to, you know, this is hard for us to, they don't feel like, they feel like they've been asked to do a job that almost makes no sense. Like you can see the images, you can see the things that they deal with. I mean, during the family separation with the children in the jail cells, I mean, that really messed up a lot of agents, like mentally, because it was horrific. But are there, yeah, I mean, there's some people in the Border Patrol, I mean, I know them, who are really callous, you know, you see too much of this and you hear from migrants that they're not being treated well. But I also think that, and I'll be right with you, that it has a lot to do with leadership. So if you have, depending on the sector, if the leadership speaks to, you know, compassion and treating people as humans, you're going to see that trickle down. And when you see leadership dehumanize migrants, you're going to see that trickle down. Yes, ma'am.
So speaking of families, do the Border Patrol agents get any training in how to recognize when it's actually people that are trying to traffic the children versus actually being parents that are with their children?
Yes, they absolutely do. I kind of want to bring our guest here, who's in the Border Patrol, up to answer some of these questions, but yes, they do. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, both the customs officers that are staffing the bridges or the crossing points, depending on where you are, as well as Border Patrol agents do get a lot of training in that. And, you know, they have intelligence also throughout Mexico. They get a briefing every morning called muster at 6 a.m. before the shift, so they know what's happening. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
With you on the border and working with other people that work on the border, are there any solutions to solve this problem of people coming across illegal, having them come through a gate or whatever? Is there any solution for that?
I mean, yeah, I think that what I'm trying to convey is that there are a lot of people who have think tanks and elected officials from the border and from other places who have come up with a lot of different ideas, but both political parties, I think, have become so vested in entrenching their positions rather than coming together to say, all right, neither of us is going to get what we want here, but this isn't safe for border communities, it's not safe for the United States, it's not safe for the migrants themselves. What do we need to do to fulfill the needs of our labor market, have a more flexible system, a more humane system, address the needs of the global, you know, recognize the global instability that is sending people, you know, on route. And, you know, what you've had is just presidents throwing paint at the wall because they've done everything by executive order. Obama, Trump, and Biden, because Congress hasn't acted.
So there's no solution. I mean, if you can't get people to work together for a solution, then you have no solution.
I had this conversation with my editor a lot. I don't know. I'm just a lowly journalist. I don't. You know, it has to be an issue for American voters. But you know, kudos to Ted. I mean, you're having this forum where everyone here is interested in this issue, and I don't know what everyone's political leanings are, or what your interest level is, but hopefully you'll also speak to your community, and they'll speak to their community. I mean, I can say that a lot of different, the border is used as political theater a lot, but there have recently been a lot of trips to the border, like Kevin McCarthy just came down with a contingent, Cornyn came down with a contingent, that was a bipartisan contingent. You know, is it theater, or is there going to be, actually when I covered Cornyn, I tweeted like, is this a turning point? The comments, ha ha ha, we've been here before, don't be naive. It's like, I won't say anything, you know. As a border resident who loves the border, I have to believe that at some point there has to be a turning point. At some point, things have to change. So, I don't know how long it's going to take them. Yes, sir.
So, I'm trying to figure out how to put this into question, because this last summer I spent some time going from Arizona to New Mexico into Texas.
Oh, cool.
And as I was going to Texas, so I was going to the Bend National Park, right, Great Bend?
Yeah.
In every other state, I saw Border Patrol, I saw people, I saw measures, there were signs, don't pick up hitchhikers and such. But when I was in Texas, I was stopped 3 different times by Border Patrol at stations. And they did the full thing, like trunks are open, everybody's out. I had 4 agents come out, checking everything. And I don't know what this, because I was a single male traveling alone, or was something, but how do you get that kind of illustration out to folks? Because as an American, I thought, I'm in Texas, I'm safe, I'm good. Why would I be subjected to this?
Did you have Florida plates, sir?
I had a rental car, but
Florida plates, highly suspect.
yeah, I would think. But it was a Texas car, but I did have the Florida license.
Can I ask you, did you get pulled over while driving, or was it a checkpoint?
It was checkpoints.
Okay, so
Yeah.
this is what we live under. In the Border Patrol has jurisdiction up to 100 kilometers into the country. So you may not have crossed into Mexico, but you would have gone through multiple Border Patrol checkpoints. And Big Bend is a big smuggling area.
Right.
So it doesn't surprise me at all. And for those of us, for example, I mean, Americans, even in Albuquerque, I used to work for the Albuquerque Journal, but I covered the border, so I was down south. And to get to Albuquerque, you have to pass through a Border Patrol checkpoint. Doesn't matter if you're American, every single person has to stop and say you're American. Some people libertarians get very upset about this, because why are they passing through a checkpoint when they're in their own country? The ACLU gets upset about it too. But my editors, I would say, you know, well, I think we were talking about a story about marijuana. They were talking about legalizing, and New Mexico had legalized medical marijuana, but you couldn't cross it through the checkpoint. And I kept saying this, and my editor kept saying, what checkpoint? And I was like, are you kidding me? Because they never came south. But anyone who lives in this swath has to go through these checkpoints. It's weird. It's a different experience. I think that if you threw a checkpoint up like in Iowa, people would be very, very angry about it. If they put it one out here on, what's your fabulous beach highway, A1A, people would be very upset about the traffic backup and having their cars potentially searched, and yeah. But actually, if you're an American citizen, I think that they needed a warrant, unless you gave them permission to search there.
There was no way around it. Like, that point was there to get through that road.
They said pop your trunk.
Yep.
Not a warrant.
It was only that, but it's like when you pull in, turn it off,
Oh.
pop the trunk. They had people come out, and I was like, I never had that happen within the U.S.
You got the extra
Other
special
countries.
treatment, because
Yeah,
a lot of times you just get waved through.
I think it's called probable cause.
Well, it could have been that I actually had maybe crossed over into Mexico, because at the point, you could walk across the Rio Grande. And I was like, I think I'm there. And I came back, and I was talking about the park, and they were like, oh no, don't go into there's like a hot springs there. They were, don't go into there because you'll get salmonella or something like that. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Wow.
Yeah, so they were really like, just keep moving.
This gentleman had his hand up first.
Yeah, we've been talking about all this rhetoric and all that. So, and I'm gonna use this word really loosely, but, or terminally loosely, how much do you think journalism is at fault for this rhetoric on that?
Good question.
And I'm using journalism good.
You're using journalism loosely. I mean, you can turn on the TV every night and see, you know, is it journalism or is it entertainment? And I think that really, has it been the past 15 years, 10 years at least, maybe longer, that television networks have also become more polarized. So, you know, I have a friend who's an academic who says every morning he watches or reads from 3 different perspectives. And unfortunately, I think, well, I don't know if I can say unfortunately. We were talking about like the halls of power. Who before, when it was always the same kind of perspective, really had the power in journalism, right? So is there room for multiple perspectives on one issue? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but what I do think is troublesome is that people tend to only watch the perspective that fulfills their sense of what they believe already. So reinforcing, right?
Well, I
So
wouldn't
to answer
call
your
it
question,
perspective.
I mean, I'll just share a story. The Fox News correspondent, I think it's Bill Malugin, he was down in El Paso, and he was there for the minute that you saw that mass crossing. It was like 900 people crossed in one night, and there were people lined up, and if I had my photos, you would see these lines of people in blankets, and it's very much an image of catastrophe, disaster in the making. But then what wasn't on the TV 3 days later was how the Border Patrol sector chief, Gloria Chavez at the time, swooped in, set up a mobile processing site so that everybody ended up in lines. She had mobile fingerprinting. She had ICE on site for anyone who didn't pass a background check. I mean, she had the whole thing going, and the whole thing was cleared out in like 3 days. But you probably didn't see that story on the same network. On the other side, you'll get MSNBC, and everything is, but people are seeking asylum, and maybe not doing enough questioning of, well, is everyone really seeking asylum, and what's the real understanding of that? I mean, that's television. I'm a writer. I tend to prefer print because it's just less, what's the word? It's less entertainment, you know? Like you really gotta do the work of reading and citing the facts, and because I go on these shows sometimes, and what I can get out in 1 minute and 30 seconds is not the whole story, you know?
Let's take time, one more question.
Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, that gentleman and then
Yeah,
maybe.
We can do
Okay.
2, let's do 2,
Okay.
yeah.
Imagine
Yeah.
you're putting together a syllabus. Give me a novel, give me a history, give me a contemporary work that my students would benefit from reading.
Oh, I just read the best, about immigration
Yeah.
or
No,
about the border?
Immigration, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I actually just read this amazing book, and I'll get your name and email because the author is escaping me because it's been a few months, but she's a Nigerian author, and she writes a novel, but based loosely on her experience as being a young Nigerian woman who moved to Michigan, and that experience. And she writes so powerfully about the immigrant experience. And I would be happy to share that with you. I was really excited when I read that book, so I'll share that with you. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I will make it really short and say thank you for the work that you do, and really, it's not so much a question, it's really the start of a much larger discussion. So, but it's that we talk so much with our students about the importance of the narrative of these very complex issues. And this is one of those very complex issues, and the question that John asked about, journalists, culpability, really, it's about that need that we have as a society, as the consumers of the information, as well as the journalists need to be able to give us those sound bites and give us those very, the solution, right? Back to that question, when the solution is not a pill that we can take, it's much more complex. And so your work is really important, and we appreciate that. And we hope that we can get our students to get these complex issues and be able to do the work that you're doing, even in TV, and radio, and whatever that might be. So thank you.
Okay, let me not badmouth it. TV television. I thought I would just take a minute and say thank you for everyone for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to come talk about the border. I hope that there's somewhere I can leave like an email or something if you'd like to stay in contact, and sir, I'd definitely like to make that book recommendation.
Well, thank you guys for coming, and of course, thank you to Lauren.
Safe travels.
And I know that's who you were talking to.
You were right on the wall. I was saw you laying down.